My name is Catherine Johnson. I'm the curator of the current Folio Space exhibition in the library, Murder in the Library, an A to Z of crime fiction. Despite what the title of tonight's seminar, if I can call it that, is, our exhibition doesn't claim to be a history. It's a taster. These are some odd things. These are some interesting things. These are some things you might like to think about. It wasn't the product of me, just me as the curator. It was actually a team of 6 people, and it was a rather unorthodox process. We all compiled an alphabet of crime, and they turned out to be radically different, all 6 of them. We then decided that we would meet consistently at 3 o'clock on Fridays, so we didn't waffle over which item to choose for which letter. We ended up sitting there till 7:30 until security threw us out, and we argued like cats. And there would have been sample conversations like, I'm not having that woman's book in this exhibition, over my dead body, and words to that effect. So we have a sample of the huge mass of crime fiction. Our competing alphabets were turned into a wonderful visual feast by our designer. It was originally meant to look rather more like a bookcase. I'm sorry it doesn't, but the colours are rather different. It's been a huge hit with school parties who we desperately have to steer away from the somewhat more lurid crime novels because they can match the colours in the graphics to the colours in the novels. And if you'd like to go back again, you can do that as well. I'm afraid there isn't a prize for somebody who gets them all. But let me turn to introducing our panel and our chairman tonight. Our chairman is Mark Lawson. He's a leading cultural broadcaster, author and journalist. I'm sure I don't need to tell you that. He recently wrote and presented that wonderful BBC Radio 4 series, Foreign Bodies, A History of Modern Europe Through Literary Detectives. He's introduced Late Review since 1994. He is the main steerer of Front Row on BBC, also Radio 4, and he's been a Guardian columnist since 1995. He's going to introduce our guests, Jason Webster, Henry Sutton, and P.D. James. I hope you enjoy the evening. Thank you very much indeed.
Good evening. I had to absolutely promise before tonight's event that I would not refer to one of the guests as Baroness James of Holland Park. So instead, I'm going to call him Henry Sutton. And he's Henry's books include Get Me Out of Here and My Criminal World, which his new book, which he'll give a little reading from later on. He also co-wrote the first posthumous sequel to R.D. Wingfield's Frost novels, First Frost. Phyllis James, or P.D. James, she has asked us, so don't think we're being rude or cheeky. She has asked us to call her Phyllis tonight, so we will. One of the most remarkable figures in literature in this country and also in public life in general, having been a governor of the BBC in the days when Director Generals often used to last for several years at a stretch. And you will not need me to tell you, but has written a huge number of novels from the first Cover Her Face to The Private Patient about Commander, as he was by the end, Adam Dalgleish. And most recently, Death Comes to Pemberley, a sequel to Pride and Prejudice with a crime twist. Jason Webster, who is here from Spain, but he just revealed, be moving back to Britain at some point, but he spent a lot of time in Spain and has begun a series of crime novels there, including Death in Valencia. And I was just telling him, when I interviewed him for radio and introduced one of his books, I said the title as Or the Bull Kills You. And my producer shouted at me that I put the stress at the end of the sentence, which you're not supposed to do in radio. But in that case, it is the correct phrase. I've just checked that. Kill the bull, or the bull kills you. My producer wanted, or the bull kills you, which, as we said, as opposed to kissing you or taking you out for dinner or anything like that. So we're going to talk about a few things tonight, and then we'll open it up to you. We'll bring the lights up and take questions. The two sort of but it's all very relaxed, the two semi-formal rounds we've got one in which the three guests will pick out some of their favourite, one or two of their favourite crime novels, and perhaps in some cases may read from them, and then there will be a little reading from one of their own books. What I wanted to start with was the first thing we see when we go into the exhibition, which was a very striking quote, but a new one to me, Phyllis, from Raymond Chandler. A crime novel is a tragedy with a happy ending. Do you think that's true? Is there any truth in that?
Oh, I think it's very true. And it's interesting, isn't it, that we read crime generally for relaxation, for fun, just to take us out of our problems of our usual world. And it's very reassuring. And yet it does have murder, ghastly murder, at the very heart of it. So there is really there's curiosity there. But on the whole, I think it's an intensely reassuring medium. And that's why I think it's very popular with people who have a great deal of responsibility in their lives. You often find that what they like to read is a detective story. And that's largely, I think, because however difficult life is in a detective story, there is a solution. There is always a solution. You may not get complete justice. You don't get divine justice. You get really the fallible justice of men. But you do, the crime is solved. If it were not solved, it wouldn't be a detective story. And I think that's what people like. So it is a happy ending to that extent.
To that extent, although in the best crime novels, and indeed in yours, we should have a strong sense that someone has died, that there has, and that can never go away.
No, I agree, absolutely, but that, I think, is comparatively modern. If we go back to Agatha Christie, sometimes I wonder if she knows how the corpse became a corpse. There is really no horror there, there's no disgust, there's no pity, really. But that is happening now, because I think we'll be talking about that, no doubt. The detective story is increasingly becoming the good novel.
Henry, a tragedy with a happy ending. As Phyllis was suggesting there, it's a historical, which is why they've got it at the start of the exhibition. It's a huge change now. You do now have crime novels in which the crime is not solved or they get the wrong person.
Yeah, I mean, I got turned on to the genre, I think, because I discovered books that actually didn't have happy endings, that didn't resolve anything, any great crime, that didn't have a sense of redemption, actually. In a way, issues of what's now known as noir fiction, if we go back, which actually was around back in the 1920s and 30s and a bit later, and particularly with novelists like Jim Thompson, who wrote the novel, of course, The Killer Inside Me. Now, that is a classic noir novel that actually, for those who have read it, and for those who are perhaps more unfortunate have seen the film, it ends in an absolutely brutal, nihilistic fashion. And classic noir fiction does that. There are no happy endings. The term is often misappropriated, actually. In fact, I noticed at the exhibition here, they're talking about Nordic noir. Now, most what we know as the Scandinavian crime novelists actually aren't what I'd call noir novelists. But nevertheless, the genesis of the sort of crime that I like, the psychological, the more psychological crime novels, certainly don't have happy endings generally. They can do, but most definitely not necessarily. And it's more to do with actually exploring aspects of warped psychologies, for want of a better word, if not really psychopaths, because that in a way is too much of a contrivance. But nevertheless, it's that slippage from being a sort of a figure who is on the edge, perhaps, of what they're doing, and then spiralling out of control. And I think crime handles those or the genre in, oddly enough, an entertaining way, very, very pertinently and perceptively.
Jason, if whether the bull kills you or the bull kills you, somebody's going to die in the book. So it's to what extent can they have happy endings?
Well, I suppose I just think that comment of Chandler. I mean, I think it's the solution thing. I'm assuming that's what was at the forefront of his mind when he came up with that, because it's, you know, there's this idea that yes, there's a problem and then it can be solved. So you have to create the problem and then to solve it. But I think there's an echo, I think, of the religious experience in this. If you look at the New Testament story of the New Testament, it's the sort of the ultimate tragedy with the happy ending and the resurrection of Christ at the end. So I think it's interesting that for the first, say 50 years of crime writing, you have got that solution. Because in a way, it's coming in, I think there's an interesting parallel between the way that society is losing, or the way that the church and religious authority is losing its control over society, just as the crime novel is coming to the fore. So the 1860s, it's immediately after the publication of The Origin of Species and what have you. So I think at the beginning, in those first few years, the crime novel in some ways is playing a role as a substitute for the religious solutions, the religious certainties of the past. That if you can then move away from that, like you were saying, with the noir novels, and so it's a later development perhaps, that you don't have to have a solution in the crime novel, because maybe the crime novel is moving away from being a substitute for, as I say, certain religious certainties in society.
I think that's very interesting, because it's been said that it is a kind of a substitute for confession, and that accounts for the fact that it's really most popular, and it began in Protestant countries, and that's still largely true.
Well, I think it's interesting because I live in Spain, and obviously, so it's a country
yes.
I'm observing, and we spoke a little bit about this when we did the radio program. The crime novel in Spain really comes to the fore sort of in the 1970s. So just as the Franco regime, and with it the church, is losing its authority. So there's an interesting parallel there between Britain in the 1860s and Spain in the 1970s. So it does be interesting to look at other countries. I don't know other countries and the history of their crime genre enough. But is there a parallel there with other countries, religion sort of losing its grip, and people are turning to the crime resolver, let's say, the detective, as a sort of substitute for the priest. It's interesting that Chesterton comes up with exactly a priest, Father Brown as his detective. But anyway, sorry to come back to your point. I mean, I think it's maybe at the beginning, yes, it's harking back to this sort of original tragedy with a happy ending. Maybe you draw away from that the further you are from
The religious
grip.
thing, I think, is very interesting. When I was making that radio series, Val McDermott said something which really, shocked me and actually in some ways appalled me. She said that it's a Protestant form. She actually said Catholics cannot write good crime fiction, which I thought was a bit. Partly because I am.
Antonia Fraser, she's pretty good, but she's absolutely right. It begins. It's strongest even now in Scandinavia, a Protestant country, far more than. It is in Italy, but not to anything like the same extent, for example, or nor in South America, the Catholic countries there. But this may be wearing away, but it is an interesting point, I think.
And when we're talking about it, the other thing that struck me in that Chandler quote is that in literary terms, because is certain of Shakespeare's plays, if you freeze frame them or indeed stop them at the interval, they appear to be tragedies. Much ado about nothing. If you stop it after the kill Claudio line, it seems to be a tragedy, and yet it's resolved as a comedy. The Winter's Tale, I suppose, is the same.
Need, isn't it? That out of evil comes good, out of misery comes happiness, out of death comes life. It seems to be a small version of that, really.
I find, as I said originally, it's crime fiction dating from the late 19th century and obviously the early 20th century, and this issue of it really, certainly in this country, the Golden Age, being surrounded by, or really the whole momentum of it to do with puzzle solving, to do with actually resolving crimes with very much good versus evil, and the good invariably being the detective of one form or another. That whole premise, as you say, I can see conceivably religious connotations to that and so on. But I wonder also how much it's to do, the popularity to do with actually pure entertainment and escapism. Chandler used to talk about this issue that actually all men need, he used the word men, I'm afraid, at the time, because obviously That was the sort of terminology, but all men need to escape the deadly rhythm of their own minds at some point. And actually by engaging in any form of reading literature, it allowed you to have an imagination, a fantasy life, and so on. And a lot of crime fiction, initially anyway, and certainly now, being a popular genre, was to do with not just escapism, but actually entertainment. And the thing that interests me is the boundaries between entertainment and actually what a lot of crime fiction is about, and has certainly become about, violence and all sorts of really grim social and also psychological issues. Yet somehow it's still perceived to be an entertainment, a form of entertainment, and all key best-selling novelists particularly view themselves as writers of entertainment rather than really anything else.
Graham Greene even using the actual term entertainment to distinguish. We'll talk about those distinctions, literary distinctions, later. So we've got some more general topics later, but so the first of our sort of formal rounds where we've asked the panelists to choose some favourites. So Phyllis, first for you.
Well, I must say The Moonstone. I think that's a marvellous novel. It's the best kind of Victorian writing. It's totally engrossing. If you've got a long plane flight, there you are. It takes it into itself. But it did. Nearly all my favourites have taught me something, and this teaches me something about viewpoint, because I think it's one of the first decisions to be made when you're writing a detective story. Through whose eyes, through whose ears, through whose brain are we going to see this happening? And I find that I like to change the viewpoint so that the one chapter will be in the mind of Dalgleish, another may be in the mind of a suspect. We could get on to the problem, a very great problem, of ever doing it in the mind of the murderer, because you're not supposed to know who the murderer is till the end. And Dorothy L. Sayers said that was why you could never write great literature, but that's another question. But and this is done magnificently. It's a very long novel, and he moves from one character to the other, and we are in their minds. So I learnt that. Then there's a Dorothy L. Sayers, which is actually here on the display, and that's the Nine Tailors. And I think this has taught me the importance of setting. It's a wonderful story, and the most important part of it is not really the crime, although the crime is interesting, and I'm not sure it's altogether. I'm not sure the reasoning is altogether. I mean, I don't think it could be done in quite the way she says. But what is brilliant about it is that we are back in the Fen villages before the First World War. And a totally different way of life from our own, and it's gone forever. And the way in which she describes the church and the village and the villagers, and then the great flood at the end when all the villagers have to go up the hill and take refuge in the church because all the dikes have burst, and there's the flood. Very, very good writing indeed, and a hugely enjoyable one. Funnily enough, I forget which American was who disliked crime novels, and he was shown this in an effort to convert him. And he said he'd never read a duller book in all his life, all about bell ringing, which didn't. And of course, the bell ringing is part of the fun of it. And then I have the franchise affair, Josephine Tay. Very elegantly told, fairly simple plot, but not only engrossing the whole way, but he is very good at the two women, one very elderly and one middle-aged and not particularly attractive, but very intelligent and a great character. And they come alive, and it's so good to have a heroine who's not 21 and beautiful for a change. And it is a very good story, and I think I love that. Then what have I got here? Oh, yes, Cyril Hare, Tragedy at Law. Cyril Hare is an example of somebody who's very successful in another field. He is a High Court judge who writes very good detective stories, but this is much the best. He's really one of those writers who writes one excellent one, and the others are all very interesting, but never quite achieve it. And here we have a judge going on circuit. And what's fascinating about this book is it takes you back into the world in England at the very beginning of the last war, when judges used to go round with great pomp and ceremony, and with a whole household with them. And there was in every sort of town they visited, there was the judges' lodgings. It all started with with a great sort of procession and a service in the largest local church, and then the poor people who'd been waiting for the judge, who were in prison, brought up and tried at the assize. And every town he visits, an attempt is made on his life. And in the end, he is murdered. It's a very good detective story, but the attraction for me is the writing. It's very elegantly written, beautifully written, and what it tells me about life in those days, and about the law, which has always rather fascinated me. So I've got those, and then I've got C.J. Sansom, The Tudor Mysteries. I love this. This is the one writing now. Long books, and I'm afraid of rather getting too long, maybe. But we're back. He is a Tudor historian. We're back here. He has a sort of hunchback lawyer, Shadwick. And it's really the one in which the king, Henry VIII, makes his passage of, we hardly call it a visit, it was a great promenade up to York to receive, you know, the apologies and the substance of because of their rebellion. The whole court, the whole lawyers, everybody moving, that they managed to do it, I don't know. So it's, you know, for me who loves history, that's absolutely fascinating. So I think I've almost got them, have I? I've got the Moonstone, I've got, yes, I think the Tudor Mysteries, and then Dorothy L. Sayers, the one in the Fens, the Nine Tailors. Those are my favourite. I also like her Gaudy Night, actually.
Oh, Gaudy Night, yeah.
I do like Gaudy Night. Many people don't like it, but I think it's very clever because what that does, and it's also a bit of a lesson to me, almost for the first time she used detective story to say something that was very important to her about the almost sort of sanctity of a job, of work, and the position of women in the colleges and in academic life at that time. But I like it, and it is a very good detective story. So that's my choice, really.
Thank you very much.
I think I've got them all here. Yes, I have. I've got them in front there.
Someone will know. That's C.J. Sansom. It's Sovereign, that one, is it? Is it called Sovereign?
It's not my area.
Yeah, it is. It's the one called Sovereign, yeah. Jason.
I suppose I thought about this. I think that the two writers who've most influenced me are Simenon and Michael Dibdin. Simenon, because I think he understands that there's something essentially poetic about crime writing. And because Chesterton talks about this as well, he says something about how the crime novel, I think he says that the crime novel, it expresses the poetry of modern life. And I feel that with Simenon as well. I mean, he always talks about how his books would start with the atmosphere, what he called the poetic line. That was always his starting point for any novel. And I think often when I read his books, the plots themselves, that doesn't stay with me. What stays with me is the sense of the book or the feeling of the book. I mean, Meg Ray can spend a whole novel just kind of tailing somebody in the rain in Paris. You know, and I just think it's amazing that he can do that. That sometimes very little can happen, but it's just that sense of where you are and an atmosphere that he just manages to express very, very well in his books. So that was a big influence on me. But also I think then particularly Michael Dibdin. I first heard about Michael Dibdin on a radio program years and years ago. And I'd lived in Italy for a while beforehand. And I just thought this sounded really interesting, so I just went and bought some of his books and was immediately taken by it. And I like the fact that he's kind of combining a police procedural and detective fiction, so that's a whodunit style. But also the fact that he's able to use this to talk about a country that he obviously knew very well and wanted to, you know, express all kinds of things about Italy and Italian society, Italian culture. So after I'd sort of lived in Spain for quite a while, it sort of sowed a seed. Reading Dibdin's book sowed a seed very much. So that after I'd lived in Spain, I thought, okay, I could do this. And Dibdin was sort of the first person I reached out for as a kind of to give me some sense of structure and where to start. So yes, very, very big influence on me.
And interestingly, both writers who were writing outside their own culture, with Simenon being Belgian but moving to France and then writing about France.
Yes, I hadn't thought about that.
Which is relatively rare, isn't it? Because most crime writers write about their own
well, maybe,
their own country.
wow,
Yeah.
maybe it's that outsider thing. I don't know. I mean, obviously with Dibdin, I felt that, you know, if he could do it, I could do it as well, you know, as an outsider. I mean, I think he was never particularly, I mean, I think in Italy, I'm not sure if his books were ever very successful. I remember an interview with him once where he said, you know, I think at the time, within Italian society, crime fiction was still sort of looked down upon. It was the yellow books, and it was just sort of, you know, like pulp fiction, I think. I don't know if that's changed since. But yeah, it sort of gave me the courage in the sense that this guy, he'd done it, and he'd done it very, very well. And I thought, if I can, you know, aspire to those heights, that would, you know, that was something, as I say, just something to reach out for.
Henry.
I was asked to design I teach creative writing at the University of East Anglia, and I was asked to design a master's module on crime fiction, writing for crime fiction, and I spent about a year deciding what texts I would have on that list for that course, and I made a decision quite early on that I wanted to really concentrate on the genesis of the modern crime thriller, as I came to call it, and the 10 novels that are on that list, I guess in a way, one way or another, actually are my favourites, or at least are representative of particular subgenres, or at least began with the beginnings of those subgenres. And I'll just go through the list very quickly, and then there's one novel in there particularly, I think, that impacted on me, or has influenced me more than most, in particular when it comes to my own writing. And the course is a 10-week course, but the first novel on there is Chandler's The Big Sleep, which of course is though Dashiell Hammett effectively is credited with really being the originator, if you like, of the hard-boiled style. Chandler, in my mind, took it to another level. The next novel is, as I mentioned earlier, one of a very sort of disturbing novel, the classic noir novel, Jim Thompson's The Killer Inside Me. And in fact, all the students I taught this year, none of them had read it before, and they were really quite shocked with that novel. It is quite brutal, and to think that it came out in over 60 years ago, again, is also really quite shocking, I think, and surprising. The next novel, after we did Hard Boiled, then we did Noir, and then we did the psychological thriller, or at least the beginning of it, which I really take that to be Patricia Highsmith's The Talented Mr. Ripley, which I think is an extraordinary novel that manages to create a character, Tom Ripley, who really is not just a murderer, obviously, but actually has an appeal. You can not quite sympathise, but you can empathise with this guy, and it's an extraordinary thing that I think that Highsmith did, and it's an extraordinary thing I think she did with actually the genre by creating this character. And to me, getting into the head, the mindset of a criminal was really quite revelatory, and I found that a really interesting premise. After that, we had John le Carré's The Spy Who Came In From the Cold, which of course is, I think, the greatest spy thriller ever written, and also one of the great British novels of the 20th century. Following that, the only one novel in translation I wanted on the list was Mara Sewell and Per Wallou's Rosanna, the first in the series of in the Martin Beck series, which I think is again the beginning of the modern police procedural, and the way that those two authors, writing together in a seamless fashion, managed to create a sense of place, a sense of time, and what it really was like to investigate some really brutal crimes was extraordinary, and it said an awful lot about the welfare state of Sweden at that particular time. So they managed to do a number of very interesting things. And after all that rather sort of heavy, dark stuff, one of the novels that I particularly want to get in there was Elmore Leonard's Get Shorty, because I think humour is one thing that crime manages, strangely enough, to do very well. But there are very few crime writers, I think, who actually do it very well. But Elmore Leonard, I think, is an absolute master at it, and that novel particularly is utterly hilarious. But it's not just that; the characterization is superb. The dialogue, of course, is absolutely fantastic, and the plotting too. He manages to do all that. Is quite extraordinary. And then following from that, we had Val McDermott's The Mermaid Singing, which again was the first novel really to look into issues of the psychological, the criminal profiler, Tony Hill there. And it's a novel that addresses issues of not just, I guess, you know, the serial killer, the psychopath, but also actually gender. And she was very much at the forefront, I think, at the time of trying to get across these more sort of feminist issues, which came in there without actually sort of ramming it down your neck. And I think that was a clever novel. And then the one novel we had under the bracket, the literary crime novel, was Martin Amis's Night Train, which I think is an extraordinary novella, actually, that it in part is actually a sort of hard-boiled or a homage to the genre, and particularly writers like Chandler and also Elmore Leonard, actually. But it moves into a different terrain towards the end of that novel, and it actually addresses, you know, is this, you know, has a crime even existed here, and what is a crime, actually? And so I think that's a wonderful novel. And then I think that the best global best-selling thriller writer on the planet at the moment is one of our own, Lee Child, who was formerly, of course, Jim Grant, born in Coventry, and I think he has managed to create something in his character Jack Reacher, an extraordinary series, and he can really write, that guy, and I think he does things.
Which one did you do?
We did The Affair, actually, because it was the novel that came out last year, and it sorry, the year before, actually. It's out in paperback now, and it's really about the beginning or how Reacher became what he is. So that worked. And then the last novel in the series, because it was a particular recent favourite of mine, was Denise Mina's The End of the Wasp season, which I think she's a great writer who manages to bring in aspects not just of police procedural, but actually, again, she's very, very keen at exploring the psychological issues of crime, and both the perpetrators and the victims, and that's something that's very important to me.
And indeed, Catholic Confession is very important in that novel, although written by a Protestant. But yeah, it's so we'll talk about a couple more general things, and then we might take some questions. We might do the readings from your own work towards the end. I think we might try that. The question of the investigator, because the other side of that Chandler quote, we had a tragedy with a happy ending. His much more famous comment is, "Down these mean streets a man must go who is not himself mean." But the character of because one of the reasons it seems to me crime fiction is tragic is that the investigators tend to be fairly tragic figures. I mean, Zen in Michael Dibdin is extremely tragic. We're now going to have a very polite argument. Dalgleish, to me, is quite a tragic figure.
Well, he's lost his wife and baby, and I think that's... yes, I'm not sure he's tragic apart from that, actually. I think in the golden age, with the women writers, and we're thinking of Agatha Christie, Dorothy L. Sayers, Naomi Marjorie Anningham, I don't think their detectives were particularly tragic, but they were all slightly romantic, and they were all sort of gentlemen, weren't they? They were all somehow... I'm not sure we felt that they were really real policemen in the way we do today. They were none the worse for that. I mean, we all love them. But obviously, if you take Dorothy L. Sayers, Lord Peter Wimsey, well, she was quite frank about why she had an aristocratic detective. She was rather poor at the time, and she wanted to write about somebody who had limitless money. And she said that when she got fed up with her miserable little flat, she gave him a wonderful apartment in London. When her carpets were showing more than usual wear, she made him buy an Obos on carpet. And when her car had broken down for the first time, then she gave him a Daimler. And occasionally, when she felt generous, she let him drive it. and I can see that this world was probably much more attractive, or she felt it would be, to her readers than having a sort of, Sergeant Plod on the job. And then the others were exactly the same, were they? In fact, when we get to, who is it, Albert Campion, Marjorie Allingham, that's very mysterious. We're told more or less he's connected with royalty. He's so grand we're not allowed to know who he is. And then we have Nio Marston. She has Roderick Elaine. And I'm afraid she was rather snobbish. They all seem to me a bit snobbish. I have to accept that. I think with Dorothy L. Sayers it was an academic snobbery. But with the others it tended to be social. And with Nio Marston it certainly was. She was really, she spent her life with some dear friends who were aristocrats. And I think she felt that was the kind of life she preferred. And Roderick Elaine, and the trouble about Roderick Elaine, he has either Inspector Fox, I think he must be, as his sort of leg man, and he will call him Foxy to show how matey they are. But I must say, I don't know why I'm rude about it, because these books have given me immense pleasure, and they are extremely well written, especially Dorothy L. Sayers, and one returns to them with what we were saying earlier, that sense of being remote from the problems of everyday life, back in a gentler England before the war, with a story that never really loses its power, and consorting with these very agreeable people. So what is to worry about?
Jason, I was very struck in the exhibition by the quote suggesting that Agatha Christie disliked Poirot. She refers to him as an egotistical creep, and we're told that she wouldn't have him on the cover of the novels. But I think this is more to do with the acting interpretations by the late John Moffat, as we have to sadly say now, and David Suchet is about to do the last one. I think there's a tragic quality to Poirot. There clearly isn't there, that he's a loner. Something has happened in the war.
Well, he's so pleased with life, isn't he? He's so pleased with himself. It's difficult to think of him as a tragic figure. But I think she did feel, why on earth did I invent him? This silly little Belgian, with his moustaches and his patent shoes and his oiled hair. And he speaks very sort of fractured English to begin with, but his English gets better and better as he goes on. And in the end, he's hardly got an accent at all. No, I prefer Miss Marple. I think most people prefer Miss Marple. I think Miss Marple is a much more human person. But I suppose she's chiefly remembered for Poirot. But she did really regret that she ever invented him. And I think Dorothy L. Sayers learned a bit from that, to do keep him at least fairly normal, otherwise he's going to end up grotesque. And Poirot is a bit of grotesque. These little cells.
He is, but I think David Suchet has made him a fascinating character in those adaptations. I think he does it brilliantly. Jason, maybe damage. The investigator, we have a sense of damage, particularly now, don't we, Rebus? I mean, these are people who have seen too much. I mean, that's...
Wasn't it just, I think it's something to do with being an outsider. I think there's something to do with the picaresque style, isn't there, I think, in crime writing, and there's that influence. And in order, the picaresque hero is always outside mainstream society. So I think if he is going to be somebody who's capable of seeing stuff that other people don't, he has to be coming from an outside perspective. So if you want to create an outsider, one of the things that you can do as a writer is, give him a sort of, a traumatic backstory, because trauma often, or trauma, much overused word, but, problems in life they're what shape us often, or how we deal with them. So that's going to give you, your particular character, your particular investigator, the perspective that he will have in order to investigate. So I think and also it's just, maybe it's just easier to write about damaged people. I mean, it's harder as a writer, I think, to write about somebody who's just happy and getting on with life. I mean, it's just sort of a writer trick, perhaps.
But it can get in the way of the plot, can't it? I get awfully bored of the baggage of some of these people, and I also think that I call it this is the sort of curry, jazz, and real ale brigade. I mean, all Rankin's, detectives and John Harvey's detectives. There was this sort of period of British writers creating characters who all drank ale, who all went to the nearest curry house or had a takeout, and all listened to jazz. And I think actually the tables are turning a bit, and I think that the baggage is going. actually, and I think for a good thing, because it does tend to actually get in the way of the plot, frankly. And if you're not really interested in jazz or real ale, it's actually, you know, you're losing quite a lot of the plot, aren't you? You're losing a lot of the story. And I think Chandler...
It is interesting, though, isn't it? The way in which the amateur has more or less died.
Yes.
And now nearly everybody starting will have a professional detective. And I suppose partly that's because they must have the background technique people want to know about all these wonderful things that the police can do. And I get a lot of help from the forensic science laboratory here. And you need it. But in the old days, they were really all virtual amateurs. Not all, but most of them were.
I think that's a crucial point, but a policeman explained to me once that it's to do with the law now, isn't it? That if you discover a crime and don't report it, you will go to jail. Because you're supposed to tell the police rather than just tootle around and solve it yourself.
But technology has created another problem, but because a lot of policing now, either as a writer, you know, it's so technical, you know, unless you spend an awful lot of time researching, you're just going to not understand it. And then also you talk to most detectives, etc., and they go on and on about how boring their job is. So I guess hence why the baggage came in. But then, you know, you can then shift the story, I think, into actually, which is why, Phyllis, you were saying, you know, don't bring in the voice, the thinking of the perpetrator, the criminal, but actually it's in a lot of novels now. You get, you know, it's often in italics. You get at the beginning, you get this
they
little...
They always talk in italics.
They talk in italics. It's their warped minds. And you get, you know, the novel with these passages interspersed of, you know, whatever torture they're exacting or whatever they're planning to do. And obviously we don't know who it is or even what sex the perpetrator is, for that matter too, because that's another twist that quite often comes into the frame. You think, oh, here's yet another male psychopath, but it's actually a female.
But technology is a good point, I think, isn't it? That it's you see in a number of novels now just the desperation to get the characters to somewhere where they don't have mobile phone reception or CCTV cameras.
And of course, DNA. I mean, honestly, DNA solves most of the old ones. You can look at read the books. If they had DNA, we wouldn't get further than chapter 1. But it's often very difficult for the writer, because I can remember many times, you know, because I've got this time structure, and then I'll sort of say when I'm at the lab, well, how long would Douglas have to wait before you got these results from the stomach contents? Oh, well, when we're busy, he might wait 10 days or fortnight. I say, I want him to know next day. So all his cases are marked high urgency, you know. But still, it is quite difficult. And sometimes they won't tell you because it's something they don't want to tell you. I mean, I think they can pinpoint now, when anybody telephones, they really can pinpoint almost what room they're in when they're telephoning. But they won't tell you how close it is. So I sort of have to say, well, roughly, you know. But one wants to know all this, absolutely, of course. And not all of it can be told.
I always think in many ways it has much less to do, actually. I think, Chandler came up with the idea that actually it was the scene, the writing, that was the most important thing. And he always used to say that, you know, if people got to the end of his novels and missed the final scene, well, it really didn't matter, because that wasn't actually the point of them. It was really the writing and the momentum that was built through characterization, description, and so on. And I do think that there seem to be two camps of writers in a way, certainly in the last 100 years. Those who actually focus more on the writing, and by that I mean, I guess, in classic sort of literary terms, characterization, dialogue, setting, description, and those who concentrate more on plot. And sometimes writers manage to meet those two big and very important components in the middle, and sometimes they don't. And sometimes writers obviously emphasize one, and other writers emphasize the other. There are no necessarily right or wrong ways of doing it, but I think there are two camps.
The thing about technology, there's a problem. I mean, it was when I started writing my novels, I did start thinking, well, surely with all the technology they've got, you know, as you could say, you could solve anything almost within a week or so. But it was when I started doing the research and talking to Spanish policemen, it was a great relief to me to find out that that there's so many budget cuts that all this technology doesn't work, you know. So it's like, I always have this great excuse now, you know, that's why the case goes on for so long.
That's great. I haven't used that, thank you very much.
There you go. Yeah.
There's going to be a lot of budget cuts in my next.
But it's also why we see so much cold case fiction now, isn't it? That you can go back into the days when crimes were harder to solve, and that's...
No, and they always, apparently, in an unsolved murder, they keep all the exhibits, all the things. That's very remarkable. Keep for 30 or 40 years, and it's never really dead, the case.
But also psychologically, that you have these, I mean, it happens in real life, that you have these people who think they've got away with it for 40, 50 years.
Yes.
And have married, had families, and then they're caught. I mean, that's an extraordinary subject psychologically, isn't it? I think.
It is. It is.
They're still alive.
There's a plot there.
Yeah.
There's a plot there.
Yeah.
Yes.
We're all working away on the next book.
We'll work away on it. It'll come out next week.
Before we open it up to the audience, the other issue which Jason and I have discussed in a radio interview is the expectation of justice, that in the classic English detective novel, the readers, they not only want justice to be restored, but they expect it to. They trusted the police. And when you get into other cultures where the police are not trusted, that becomes a big issue, I think. Jason?
Well, yeah, certainly in Spain, because we were talking with Antonio Hill about that, and he said that comment about how in Mexico, was it that he told some friends in Mexico that he was writing crime novels, and they said, well, why are you doing this? You know, the police are the bad guys.
Yeah.
You know? So
no, they actually said to me, why would you have a cop as a hero?
Yes,
they couldn't understand that. Yeah.
I don't think the genre can work at all unless the police are honest. It couldn't work. You're quite right. How could it work? You've just got to know the people investigating are telling the truth. Otherwise, there's no real problem. There's no real mystery. The whole thing is a nonsense, isn't it?
Or you have your single honest man, like Zen, for example.
Yeah.
He's, you know, a single good man in this corrupt.
Although they're bad,
organisation.
they can be quite corrupt, can't they? Now, I mean, Zen, Rebus, they're essentially bad guys who do the right thing in the end. Often these.
Yeah, I suppose. I mean, when I wrote the first draft of the first crime novel, and this came from a policeman who told me this, and I included it into my character. He'd actually taken some money. There was a drugs raid, there was a dead man on the floor, and there was like 50,000 euros just spread over the floor, and he just sort of took like a few hundred and put it in his back pocket. And in Spain, that's just kind of okay, you know, and I sort of thought, I thought this is very realistic, I'll put this into, I've got this from the horse's mouth, so I sort of gave this to my character. He'd done this in the past, and my publishers came back and said, I really don't think you should do this, you know, so, a British audience would not be quite so sympathetic to this sort of thing. So I did change it, but I think, yeah, no, I mean, there's a sort of certain degree of law breaking, but there has to be some sort of moral overview, surely, at the end. I mean, that he is working to some greater moral good, even if he can break the rules along the way.
Oh, but it was Highsmith, of course, who said that art has nothing to do with morals or moralising or convention, and I think that actually is an interesting point of view, and it brings into play inherent corruption and sort of instability that an awful lot of people seem to encounter, if not suffer themselves.
Well, when you get to Dexter, in which the detective is a serial killer, I mean, that's the extreme, the extreme end of the spectrum.
But an extraordinarily well-functioning serial killer, which is why actually the contrivance there is sort of absurd.
If we could bring the lights up, I think we can do that, and then we can take... yes, thank you. Excellent. We'll take questions from the audience for a while, and then we might move towards some... Yeah, we'll do our readings probably more towards the end. Who would like... Yes, sir. Would you? Have we got microphones? We have. So we'll get a microphone down to that gentleman with the scarf, if you put your hand up, and then we'll see how we go from there.
Thank you very much. I was interested in the description of the waxing and waning of religious faith and Protestantism, particularly in connection with the mid-19th century. But I'd rather thought that at that time, with the creation of the Metropolitan Police CID, who started, I think, as plain clothes, wouldn't that also have engendered a great interest in detection and that would have given rise to what we see repeatedly now, the first detective story, which was all around the time of the 1850s to 1860s, when detection became a career, really, and an interest, and something that really motivated an interest in people.
I'll just repeat that. In fact, well, you worked on a historical crime story as well. The significance of the mid-19th century and the rise of a professional police force, and the significance of that to the genre.
Well, I think it was very significant. In fact, I forget who it was, but a very well-known detective writer has said he didn't think you could have a proper detective story until there was the detective force in the Metropolitan Police. And certainly when we look at crime novels which are in the past, then we have to try and be accurate about what was happening at that time. And this was a huge change for the police. Before then, really, it was total muddle. River police and those poor unfortunate watchmen, you know, who were usually over 80 and couldn't wait to get back into their cosy little corners, actually, you know, actually investigating crime. And it's certainly, with my last book, Death Comes to Everybody, that's naturally long before there was an official police force. And then it was left locally, the magistrates and the local constables. And they appointed the local constables, and the magistrates and the constables before them investigated. And the general view was, always leave everything to local people. They know what's going on. Don't bring it up to London. And we've always had this strong feeling, haven't we, that we mustn't have a national police force. We never have. And maybe we shall end by having it. But the general feeling was, no, if you have that, they'll get too strong, and there'll be some bad eggs, and goodness knows what will happen. Keep it local, and people will keep an eye on them. So it has made a huge difference, I think, to crime writing, and of course, mainly to police investigation.
Although every government suggests it, don't they? A British FBI. It's the first thing they all say now.
They more and more. I think this is because crime has become so international, and the big criminals are very, very wealthy men dealing in drugs or dealing in narcotics, and they go right across boundaries, obviously. And therefore, it does seem silly to have your police force, just one police force, dealing with your country. They've got to. And of course, there is on Interpol, but there's sometimes a feeling that we need more organisation, we need more cooperation, we need more technology used to get these people.
Also, you worked at the Home Office famously in your time, but it is the case, isn't it, that some serial killers were not spotted in Britain for quite a long time because they killed people in different counties, and therefore they didn't put together the killings.
I can't say I know any particular thing, but I think it could well be. But of course, what we had in those days was calling in the yard. And nowadays, of course, the yard is not called in so often because every police force has its forensic science service. Every police force has all the necessary technical resources it needs. And the yard, you know, I don't think they're ever called in. They were called into the Yorkshire Ripper, but only to look and see what was happening and generally approve it. But otherwise, there is the local police really are responsible for everything that happens within their boundaries. And that may change, I suppose.
And Jace, in a Spanish context, you have that in the relationship between the different police forces. Yes. That's one of the fascination of your books. Just for people who haven't yet read it, take us through that. It's quite dizzying, isn't it?
Yeah, you've got a national police force called La Policía Nacional, and they deal with towns and cities with a population of more than 50,000 people, I think. Anywhere else, the countryside and villages, what have you, they're looked after by the Guardia Civil, the civil guard, who were the main, that was what Franco used mainly as his sort of, tool of repression. And then you've got local police as well. So a town, like a big city, might have its own municipal police. And then you've got that's right, you've got the regional police as well. It just goes on and on and on. And actually, I talked to a policeman. I said, well, there must be lots of rivalries and what have you. And there are some really big rivalries, but surprisingly not so much between the national police and the civil guard, who are, as I say, they're also on a national level. It's the guys who the national police really don't like are the municipal police, because they get paid more than they do, and they have a sort of really sort of easy job apparently, you know. So so the national police get all the really hard work, and then they actually get paid less. So you can use that quite a lot, you know. It's good material for the books.
Yeah.
And the thing,
I suppose really, you know, terrorism must have made a huge difference, really, hasn't it? I mean, the close cooperation between the police fighting coalition and MI6 or MI5, whatever, the Secret Service. This is an entirely different kind of policing, isn't it, in a way?
I think you've got this idea, it's similar in the sense that you've got this idea that you shouldn't have too much power with one police force. So in Italy and France, you've got the same thing, you know, dividing it up. But in Spain, obviously, there was the whole business in the 1980s when the police actually turned terrorists against the terrorists, and they created the GAL, this sort of illegal organization that went around kidnapping and killing suspected ETA members. So yes, things went really topsy-turvy.
All power creates corruption. So the more powerful a police force is, or a security service for that matter, the more prone to being corrupt. I mean, Scotland Yard now, you know, what are they doing? They're in the pockets of News International, you know, I mean. I don't have, I'm afraid, you know, I'm very sceptical and rather cynical about the effectiveness actually of a lot of what the police are meant to be doing, and certainly things like, you know, white collar crime, financial crime. They're way behind the curve on that.
but the question of
It provokes a lot.
yeah, but the question of jurisdiction, though, because you get that in Northern Irish crime fiction now, which is beginning to come out.
Yeah.
Because the range, it's like Spain there. The novels that are being written now about the troubles in Northern Ireland.
Yeah.
You have the British Army, you have the RUC, you have, then there's the other one, which I don't get the initials right. There was the the Ulster, yeah. And then you have the Republic of Ireland Police. But you have that in your novels, that trying to get a crime off onto someone else. There are famous stories from Ireland. If bodies were found in the river or the sea, there would be arguments over where the person actually died in order to who took the case.
Aren't they more likely to be crime novels than detective stories?
Yeah.
Oh, yes, you see the distinction.
I think they are.
Just talk to us about that distinction.
Well, I think that to be a detective story, you have to have the mystery at the middle. You have to have a closed circle of suspects. You can't have numerous suspects, which, of course, when you're talking about international terrorism, there's no limit to the suspects you might have. You have a detective who comes in to solve the crime, and by the end of the book, you should be able to reach the right decision yourself by logical deduction inserted in the book with deceptive cunning but essential fairness. That put very, very brutally is what a detective story is. There must be a mystery, there must be a logical, reasonable solution. You don't have to go into justice and whether you went to prison or didn't go to prison. There has to be a solution. But when you're talking of a crime novel, it's entirely different. It's absolutely different. And I mean, I suppose Brighton Rock is an example of a crime novel. We know from the beginning that Hale is going to be murdered. We know that Pinky is rotten. And the interest in the book is what is going to happen to these people, including Pinky's unfortunate girl wife. But there's no mystery there. We know. And the excitement is quite otherwise than solving a mystery.
So which genre do you two think you're writing in, Henry?
That's a good question. In fact, I spent an awful lot of time talking to colleagues and students about the genre, even calling my course the writing of crime / thriller fiction. And I'm thinking of dropping the / for next academic year. I'm not even quite sure why. And then I'm thinking, well, thrillers are always fictional anyways. You can't have thriller fiction is nonsensical, but you couldn't. So I guess crime is I write crime novels is in the broadest sense, but they incorporate bits of psychological crime and also to a certain degree in my most recent novel slight aspects of procedural.
Jason?
I think I'm writing police procedurals. I'm still working it out. But there's an element of the whodunit there as well, so I'm sort of blending genres.
You can also write the procedural thriller now, so I saw the other thing.
Yes, this side. Anyone like to start for this side with a question? Yes, madam. Can we get Microphone down there.
We were talking earlier about escapism and entertainment, but nowadays quite a lot of the crime novels are seen as social documents. I just wondered how you felt about that.
That was about the crime novel we talked about as entertainment, but they're seen as often as social documents now. A lot of, when I was making the series for Radio 4, a lot of the younger writers, they talk about using it to make a statement or a point.
Yes, indeed they are. And I think part of it is writing more realistic novels, because I like to set mine unambiguously in the present age. And as I've got a girl detective, and she, in one of the books, she had a very sick granny who'd brought her up. It was natural in that book that the police would expect her, or at least the social services expected her, to give up for a time and get leave to look after granny in a way they would never have expected anybody else to. So you don't set out to write a feminist novel, but you just have to be aware of these issues, because they're now part of society. And if you're trying to write a realistic novel, and it's interesting with my friend Ruth Rendell that increasingly she is using the crime novel to say something about matters that are important to her, whether it's race or whatever it is. And I think that is happening. And the point is, you need to do it very subtly, because you're really not wanting to be a didactic writer. You're not going to want to reform people. You're telling a story and creating a mystery. But there must always be this knowledge of the society in which it is set. And your society, you know, is a very different society from the one in a village in England.
Although, Phyllis, you had one of the great feminist titles still often used in headlines about various issues, an unsuitable job for a woman. I mean, you see that very often, and that's it's quite a provocative title, that, isn't it?
Well, it was. So, of course, that was set some time ago, and then, indeed, she was taking over. She was working for a small detective agency, a very unsuccessful one, and the detective killed himself and left her the agency. And she took it over. And the general feeling there, of course, well, it's a very unsuitable job. She'll never make a go of it. But she did make a go of it. I loved that book. I thought it was rather good.
Yeah, it was. Do you think of yourself as a feminist writer?
No, I think of myself as a writer. I think I am a feminist in that I love my sex, in a sense, and I feel that there is a lot that needs doing and making fair, which is not fair. Huge advantages have happened in my long lifetime. I mean, I've lived for 92 years, and believe me, when I was a child, you would never have thought that a woman could be Prime Minister or a Chief Constable or actually be in charge of an aircraft, or one I met the other day who was captain of a ship of war. You know, it's just incredible what women have achieved and will continue to achieve, but there are still all sorts of rather nasty, I think, differences. And I think that I particularly dislike the sort of atmosphere I think you can get in some offices, which is just anti-female and anti-woman. I don't think it helps anybody to keep stressing that. We are making things better, I think, all the time, and women are achieving. And we must never forget that women who want to stay at home and bring up children are doing an incredibly important job. And they should have the choice of doing that if they want it. We ought to have the choice. And I think largely we have the choice. And that just must be reflected in our novels.
Do you fancy being Prime Minister? You'd be be very good.
Not at the present.
You've got a book. Although
I'm not thinking of doing away with Dave, although it might be quite an advantage.
Although we talked about this before, and because Death Comes to Pemberley is a sequel to Jane Austen, in the English novel, to make that distinction, both the traditional novel and the crime novel has always been dominated by women, hasn't it? I mean, that's one of the historically interesting, that Jane Austen, George Eliot, the crime novel famously.
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. And women are very good at it. Women are very good writers.
They also make up, obviously, the largest proportion of readers as well, certainly of crime fiction. Of all fiction.
I think all fiction.
But crime fiction, I think that the gender divide is something like 75% to 25%.
And I think women find the detective story, not the crime novel, the detective story, particularly agreeable because it provides this structure. And within that structure, you can deal with really violent emotions and violent deeds and murder and all sorts of deeply unpleasant and disturbing things, which a woman might really rather hesitate to put in a straight novel. I think it is a very, very supportive.
Yes, we'll come over. I'll go from one side to the other. Yes, gentleman at the front, if we could bring the microphone. Oh, we'll bring that one across. And then anyone on this side who'd like to, we could have the microphone ready for you. Yes, there's a lady down here at the front. If we could get that microphone down to her, and we'll take this gentleman first.
I'm a science teacher, and I was very interested in G.K. Chesterton's story where he confronts Father Brown and Sherlock Holmes. I think it's the case of Mr. Glass. And the BBC did a wonderful broadcast where the crime is really Sherlock Holmes condemning someone who's innocent because of his method. So my question is, in terms of that story, you have the priest who's got holistic and non-reductionist who empathises with the victim to solve the crime, and then you have the rationalist, reductionist scientist who actually destroys through his solution, he creates his own crime in a way. I mean, I'm fascinated by how detective and crime novels look at the way we seek truth and portray that within their stories.
That comes back to almost the question over here is about realism too, doesn't it? And social, the sort of social aspect of working out or interpreting and indeed exploring reality now and where we live and how we live and so on. I mean, I think it's very hard to actually go out and think, right, this novel, which is meant to be entertainment one way or another, and obviously the novel, its conventions, is full of various contrivances and so on, to actually make it completely truthful in that sense. But obviously I think the aim of the writer anyway is to try and achieve some form of truth or try and get to that question at least. And I guess the more the more boundaries, parameters you have on a particular form, a particular genre, the harder it is in a way to actually exercise aspects of truth. If you are bound up very much with a plot that revolves around a set of precedents, you know, what sort of truth are you actually achieving there? I mean, in the more historical sense of crime fiction, which is why I think the question over here asked the question, you know, is crime writing now actually more realist? Is it more, you know, is truthful the right word? I'm not sure, but it's certainly, it's certainly become more realist.
The importance of truth.
Yes, no, I think it's crucial. I think it's crucial to the genre itself, and how a particular detective goes about trying to uncover that truth. I mean, one of the reasons that I'm attracted to Simenon is because I think it's the psychology. He understands the psychology of the perpetrator or a situation. So that's, I think, how he's reaching his conclusions. It's not just this sort of, you know, the scientific or reductionist approach. But that makes him attractive to me as a human being, I think. So how your detective goes about solving the crime, it's like maybe it reflects in some way you as a writer or not, if you're choosing not to have your detective as a sort of an alter ego. But it's sort of how you're approaching life itself, and how what's your take on just the mystery of existence, I think.
Although one of the reasons the spy novel, I mean, Henry mentioned spy novel, is so fascinating, I think, is that, I mean, Le Carré, one of the reasons he's an astonishing writer, I think, is the relativism, that there is no truth to be
and the shifting
found.
Identities too. But in a way, Le Carré's main aim was actually, you know, his aim of fire, if you like, were corrupt institutions, and that was his thing. What he was championing in a way was the individual, was a sense of individual freedom rather than actually a institutional freedom. And I think in a way that's the truth he was looking for.
You've always got the movement towards truth, haven't you? Even if you don't find it at the end, or it's relative, or it's uncertain. The move towards truth is crucial to the genre to begin with.
But that famous, I won't say which one in case you haven't read it, but the famous exchange at the end of one of the Le Carre's, George Smiley, you won, George. And he says famously, I suppose I did. Did I? And he doesn't think he did. But I mean, I think that's an amazing moment. Yes, the lady in blue.
I heard Ian Rankin recently express the view that men can't write good women detectives. I just wondered if the panel... I've been struggling since then to think of an example to disprove that, but I haven't succeeded. I wonder if the panel have got any ideas.
I'll just repeat that, Henry, for Phyllis. Yes, Ian Rankin said recently that men cannot create convincing women detectives. He gave that as a reason for why he didn't make Siobhan the central character after Rebus left. Do you think that's true, that men can't create successful women detectives?
Well, unfortunately, we haven't enough examples, have we? They haven't really created them in any large numbers. Certainly, I can't, at the moment, just think of one, whether successful or not successful, that a man has created. And they usually, when they are created, in a sort of subordinate role. You don't usually find a man responsible to a woman. And of course, in many police forces, that is how it is, because the woman is chief constable. But that has not sort of got into fiction yet, and I wonder whether it will. I think it would be difficult. I think it's much easier for women to create men than it is for men to create women. I think to an awful lot of men, we are still one huge secret society that they can never quite understand.
Although one of my great campaigns is, I think Linda LaPlante has not been given enough credit. Partly it's on television, but Jane Tennyson is one of the crucial characters in crime fiction.
But then you see a woman.
Well, that's what I mean. No, I'm giving her that credit. But she introduced. There was nothing before that of anything.
Henry, I'm trying to think. I mean, a novel I've read. In fact. Lee Child's most recent novel, A Wanted Man, has two strong female characters who are key CIA, and one's CIA, one's FBI. So they're not the lead characters, but they are key characters, and he, surprisingly perhaps, always creates very strong female characters who might be, a local police chief or someone quite high up in the FBI, for instance, or the army for that matter.
It also ties into the latest question about reflecting society, because Linda LaPlante says when she wanted to research it and she rang up and asked to speak to a woman DCI, yes. They said, well, there only are two of them, so you have to speak to one or the other. So it's...
But I think any novelist, if you can't create characters that are not of your gender, then you perhaps shouldn't be in the game. I mean, I think you have to be able to create male and female characters as easily as one or the other.
Although it's a very common view that male writers are not as good at women as women are at men. This view is put forward by women critics and novelists very largely. But do you agree with it?
No.
Jason? Sorry, Phyllis.
So sorry. I'm sorry,
no.
I was just going to say, when it comes to Tennyson, she's not exactly happy, is she? That's the point.
No, that's
she's
right.
Tremendously successful, but as a woman, she's not a happy woman in any of her relationships. And I think that happens really with almost all fiction when you get a really strong woman. You don't usually come that she's got a very happy marriage, 3 or 4 gorgeous kids. No, doesn't seem to work like that.
No. That's what I was saying. I think there are almost no happy detectives in fiction. Maigret is perhaps happy, many. Isn't he? Maigret is happy.
He's
contented.
Happy at home,
yeah.
And he's faithful to his wife, unlike his creator, famously.
Yeah. Yes, we'll come back to this side. Anyone here who would like to... We're going to close with readings a moment. Last chance to raise a hand on that side. Don't go home regretting. No, okay. Anyone on that side who would like to ask? Yes, I can see. I can see a hand there at the back. Yes. Can we get a microphone? I can see a sort of burgundy hand. Yeah.
At the beginning of a detective story, do you always know who the perpetrator is going to be?
At the beginning of a story, do you always know who the perpetrator is?
I do, because that's how I work, really. I plot in great detail, very great detail, and I have the structure in all set and down in black and white in notebooks and so on before I begin. But what is interesting is the book always changes when you actually write it, so you never get the book you thought you were going to get, not completely, but certainly I know, you know, who did it, why he or she did it, who the suspects are, what their motives were, how the truth will be discovered. All that is clear in my mind before I start writing.
And just between friends, is there a book on the way at the moment?
Well, there's a plot in my mind, and I'm rather excited by it, but quite frankly, in 93 in August, and I'm not sure entirely fit, and I would hate to leave something unfinished. That's really rather a horror. It used to be when I did overseas tours and was flying a lot. I always took the book I was working on, of course, but I thought that's the worst thing if this plane goes down in the ocean. A book unfinished which somebody will tamper with. So who knows? If I have the energy, I'd love to do one more, just one more.
We hope so. Do you know?
No, not normally. Or sometimes when I start a novel, I think I know, and then I change a quarter of the way through, third of the way through. I sort of think if you know as a writer, then somehow the reader will know right at the beginning. Because, you know, every sort of sentence is somehow leading towards that reveal. So no, I don't like to plot that closely.
I don't know whether it was Ruth, but I think somebody, it may have been Ruth Rendell, who completely changes in the last chapter and think, that'll fool them.
I plot very carefully, yes, before I start writing, because I think then I can when I'm writing, I can concentrate on writing, and I'm not having to think about plotting. So that would, you know, my brain isn't quite big enough to do the two things at once. So that's, yes. So I try to sort of limit what I need to actually do when I'm actually doing the writing. But like with you, I find that things can change.
They do change.
It's suddenly that, you know, your character leads you in a different direction.
Exactly.
But essentially, the core is there and from the beginning.
And do you have those moments when suddenly something is solved? It's a tricky thing, and you just feel, oh, it never happened like this. This is the feeling I've got. This is wrong. It all hangs together, but there's something wrong about it. And then in the morning, you suddenly think, that's where he went. That's what she did.
Yes.
That's a wonderful feeling.
One of the things, yes, usually when you're just waking up, it's coming out of a dream.
It comes.
Very much
It's a marvellous feeling.
Okay, we haven't got that much time, so we have a short little reading from each of our writers. So, are you ready? Yeah.
You want me to go first?
Could you go first, please, if you can? But with the eye on brevity.
I'm just going to get comfortable now. Right, this is the very beginning of my new novel, which will be out in April, and it's about a crime writer struggling with his new novel. Here we go. As ever, I'm probably staring out of the window at flowers, at foliage anyway, a few straggly roses, clematis, possibly ferns perhaps, a vine maybe, and plenty of other stuff, weeds notably. Or I'm looking at the sky through the long, slim, slightly grimy panes above the French windows, watching clouds build and threaten while urging my mind to race off elsewhere. Or I'm just looking at my screen, my chapped, chubby hands hovering lamely over the keyboard. Perhaps I'm glancing at the books and paperwork stacked up on my desk, the mounds of receipts and bills, invoices and remittance slips, contracts and invitations, the odd bit of fan mail too, having arrived the old-fashioned way via my publishers and through the letterbox. I like to hang on to these cards, these letters. Some, I guess, have been sitting there for a while. So in many ways, while trying to avoid these things that'll never get properly dealt with or filed, and trying to concentrate, trying to think about what I do best, while panicking a little because a deadline is looming, more bills have to be paid, and my brand enhanced, an image appears as if from nowhere. Thank God. Not of course that I believe in one. In my game, this then is how I'm going to begin it. First light, Christmas morning. A thin, freezing fog was drifting in from the sea across the tide line, the frosted dunes, and curling around the decrepit hotels and guest houses, the long since shut and boarded arcades and amusements. A funfair from another era lost further up the Golden Mile. He crossed the road, his dog trotting obediently by his side. Out of habit, he looked behind him, in front again, scanned every which way, not that he could see far, but far enough to tell he was the only fool about at this time and in this place, why he liked it. His grey Hugo Boss puffer was zipped tight, his orange beanie pulled low, yet still the air was getting straight to his bones. Once on the sand, Baz, his black and tan boxer, immediately bounded out of view, increasing his pace, not because he was worried about the dog, but to try to generate some warmth. He headed straight towards the sea on a faint path. They always went the same way across this area of outstanding natural beauty. How it had been designated as such was a mystery. Baz, he shouted at last, where the hell are you?
Thank you very much. And Jason.
Okay, so this was the shortest extract I could find. My detective, and he's with his colleague, and they're eating lunch. They spend a lot of time eating lunch, actually. I think there's a basic sensuality to Mediterranean crime writing, which I try to get across. So my detective Max Camera is with his colleague Torres, and they're having paella. They're eating paella together instead of chasing the bad guys. There's a kind of rating system for rice dishes, Torres said, all part of the mystery of paella. You're not going to get mystical on me, are you? Paella is not just food for a Valencian, it's a way of life. Torres took a swig of his fizzy red drink and pursed his lips. You know all this already, or at least you should do. You've been here long enough. All right, Camera held up his hands. No disrespect. So what's this rating system then? Bo, rebo, and mel. Torres flicked out his fingers as he listed the words. It's like giving marks to a paella depending on how good it is. Camera chuckled. Serious stuff, Torres stared at him. A family can spend the whole mealtime arguing over which grade to give the paella. All right, so what do they mean? Torres gave him a look. Bo, as you should know by now, is Valencian for good. Rebo means very good. And mel means honey. That's the top mark? Torres frowned. Kind of. Well, is it or isn't it? There's another one above that, but it's hardly ever used, perhaps never. It belongs to the perfect archetypal paella, like some kind of platonic ideal. One that's been made over an open fire using only wood from an orange tree and using Valencian water. Of course, it's impossible to make paella from water from anything else. Doesn't come out the same. And this top mark is de categoría, Torres said, his Valencian accent thickening slightly, all open vowels like a yowling cat. You think Plato had paella in mind when he was coming up with his theory of forms? There's a form for everything, Torres hit back, even the hairs in your nose. Or at least that's what my mate Joaquin told me at school. I never did understand much in philosophy classes. Camera lifted up a spoon of rice and meat. So what category is this one then? I reckon it's pretty mel. Get out of here. You don't know what you're talking about. This? He pointed at his plate and frowned in concentration. Bo. You can't give it more than that. Camera put the spoonful in his mouth. It tasted all right to him, perhaps a little heavy on the oil, now that he thought about it. So what's below bo, then? What happens if it's a bad paella? Torres scowled. No such thing, he said.
What is the name of that book, my dear?
Death in Valencia.
Death in Valencia.
Death in Valencia, yes.
And I'm sure Jason will give you one afterwards if you'd like a copy.
No, I don't believe in that. I'll buy one.
And P.D. James.
Yes, well, I'm going to read a short bit, so putting it in thing. This is in Pemberley. Elizabeth has been married to Darcy for 6 years. There are 2 babies upstairs in the nursery. She's had a wonderful evening with her sister there, the Bingleys are there. They've been having music, Georgiana's been playing, everything has been civilized and peaceful. And then Darcy looks out of the window just when they're going to bed, and there is this chaise coming at huge speed towards the house, out of a part of the estate which is called the Wild Wood, because it really is very wild. And here they are. It's coming at immense pace. The coach was still coming at speed, rocking round the corner at the end of the woodland road to approach the house. Elizabeth thought that it would surely rattle past the door, but now she could hear the shouts of the coachman and see him struggling with the reins. The horses were pulled to a halt and stood there rootless and neighing. Immediately, and before he could dismount, the coach door was opened, and in the shaft of light from Pemberley, they saw a woman almost falling out and shrieking into the wind. With her hat hanging by its ribbons round her neck, and her loose hair blowing about her face, she seemed like some wild creature of the night, or a mad woman escaped from captivity. For a moment, Elizabeth stood rooted, incapable of action or thought. And then she recognized that this wild, shrieking apparition was Lydia, and ran forward to help. But Lydia pushed her aside, and still screaming, thrust herself into Jane's arms, nearly toppling her. Bingley stepped forward to assist his wife, and together they half carried Lydia to the door. She was still howling and struggling, as if unaware who was supporting her. But once inside, protected from the wind, they could hear her harsh, broken words. "Wickham's dead. Denny has shot him. Why don't you find him? They're up there in the woodland. Why don't you do something? Oh, God, I know he's dead." And then the sobs became moans, and she slumped into Jane's and Bingley's arms, as together they urged her gently towards the nearest chair.
Thank you very much. There'll now be, the authors will sign their books. Thank you to our audience. Thank you to Henry Sutton and to Jason Webster. I'm sure they won't object if I say that it's a particular privilege to be with P.D. James, who I am now going to call Baroness James of Holland Park. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thanks.